She was banished by her people, but the Apache called her Sister of the Wind. The trading post stood like a weathered sentinel against the New Mexico desert, its adobe walls bleached white by decades of relentless sun. Sarah Mitchell pressed, her back against the rough wall, feeling the heat seep through her cotton dress as she watched the dust cloud approach from the east. 3 riders, their silhouettes wavering in the afternoon heat like mirages that refused to dissolve. "They're coming for you," whispered Tom Garrett, the trading post owner, his weathered hands trembling as he sorted through ammunition boxes with unnecessary precision. "Word travels fast out here, Sarah. What you did, what they say you did." Sarah's fingers found the small silver locket at her throat, a habit she'd developed since the accusations began. Inside was a photograph of her younger brother James, taken before consumption claimed him, before the medicine she'd given him became the center of a controversy that would tear her life apart. "I saved him 3 more months, Tom. 3 months of laughter, of stories by the fire. How is that a sin?" The trading post smelled of leather, tobacco, and the perpetual dust that seemed to coat everything in this corner of the territory. Sarah had arrived here 2 weeks ago, fleeing the Christian settlement of Millbrook, where she'd lived for 8 years as the town's herbalist and midwife. The elders had called her methods ungodly, her knowledge of native plants and healing techniques consorting with heathen practices. The final accusation, that she'd poisoned her own brother with savage medicine instead of trusting in prayer, had come like a physical blow. "Sarah," Tom's voice carried the weight of genuine concern. "These men aren't coming to talk. Reverend Morrison's got them convinced you're some kind of witch or something. They're talking about taking you back for trial." Through the small window, Sarah could see the riders more clearly now. Morrison's broad frame was unmistakable, his black coat a stark contrast against the pale landscape. Beside him rode 2 men she recognized from Millbrook, farmers whose wives she'd helped through difficult births, whose children she'd treated for fever and broken bones. Men who had once thanked her with tears in their eyes, now coming to drag her back for judgment. "I won't let them take me," Sarah said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I did nothing wrong, Tom. I learned those healing methods from Maria Sandoval before she died. She taught me because she said knowledge shouldn't die with the person who carries it." Tom nodded, understanding more than most the value of Maria's knowledge. The old woman had been respected by settlers and Apache alike for her ability to heal wounds that would have claimed lives, to ease pain that laudanum couldn't touch. "Maria learned from the Apache women," Tom said. "Her grandmother was Chiricahua." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Sarah moved away from the window. She thought of Maria's words, spoken in a mixture of Spanish and broken English during those precious months of teaching. "The plants, they don't care who you are, mija. They only care if you listen to what they tell you." Reverend Morrison's voice boomed across the desert air as the men dismounted. "Thomas Garrett, we know she's here. Send out the Mitchell woman and no harm will come to anyone else." Sarah looked around the trading post, at the shelves lined with goods that connected this isolated outpost to the wider world, at Tom's kind face creased with worry, at the back door that led to the vast expanse of desert beyond. She had 2 choices: surrender to men who would never understand that healing came in many forms, or step into an unknown that might offer something her own people never could: acceptance. "Tell them I'm not here, Tom," Sarah said, moving toward the back. "Dori, tell them I headed north toward Santa Fe. Where will you go?" Sarah paused, her hand on the door latch. In the distance, beyond the immediate danger, she could see the mountains where Maria had said her grandmother's people still lived free. "Somewhere I can be useful," she said. "Somewhere healing isn't considered a crime." As she stepped into the desert heat, leaving behind the world that had rejected her, Sarah Mitchell couldn't know that she was walking toward a destiny that would transform not just her own life, but the understanding between 2 peoples separated by fear and misunderstanding. The desert at sunset painted the world in shades of copper and gold, but Sarah felt only the growing chill that came with nightfall in the high country. She had been walking for 6 hours, her leather boots now caked with red dirt and her water nearly gone. Behind her, the trading post had long since disappeared, swallowed by the rolling hills and endless scrub brush that characterized this harsh landscape. She paused beside a cluster of prickly pear cactus, recognizing the plant from Maria's teachings. Carefully, she used her small knife to cut away a pad, scraping off the spines before cutting it into strips. The flesh was bitter but moist, providing precious water her body desperately needed. As she chewed the cactus, she heard the sound she'd been dreading, the distant baying of hounds. Morrison had brought dogs. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she forced herself to think clearly. The Reverend was more determined than she'd anticipated, and the tracking dogs would follow her scent regardless of how cleverly she tried to cover her trail. She needed to find water, a stream or wash that would mask her passage, or she needed to find sanctuary among people who wouldn't hand her over to Morrison's brand of justice. The sound of the dogs grew closer, and Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Instead of continuing to flee, she began to climb. The rocky outcropping ahead would be treacherous in the failing light, but it would also make tracking more difficult. More importantly, Maria had once mentioned that her grandmother's people had sacred places in the high country, places where they still came to gather medicine plants and pray. As she climbed, her hands finding purchase on sun-warmed stone, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been planning to marry David Hartwell, the banker's son, and settle into the comfortable predictability of frontier town life. Then James had fallen ill, and everything changed. The conventional treatments, bloodletting, mercury compounds, prayer, had only weakened him further. In desperation, she'd turned to Maria's teachings, brewing teas from willow bark and desert sage, creating poultices from plants whose names she spoke in whispered Spanish. James had improved dramatically. For 3 blessed months, he'd been strong, enough to help with chores, to court the baker's daughter, to talk about his dreams of starting a ranch. When the consumption finally claimed him, it was peacefully, without the agonizing struggle that characterized most deaths from the disease. Sarah had thought she'd given him a gift, time and dignity in his final months. The Reverend saw it differently. To him, Sarah's methods were an affront to divine will, a dangerous precedent that might lead others away from proper Christian submission to God's plan. The fact that her treatments had worked only made them more threatening. Now perched on a narrow ledge 30 feet above the desert floor, Sarah could see the lights of Morrison's search party moving through the darkness below. They would reach the base of the outcropping soon, and the dogs would lose her scent among the rocks, but they wouldn't give up easily. She needed to keep moving, to find the high places Maria had described. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard it, the low whistle that sounded almost like wind through stone, but carried a distinctly human cadence. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Someone was nearby, someone who was deliberately making their presence known, without revealing their exact location. "I'm not armed," she called out softly, her voice barely carrying over the desert wind. "I'm alone." Silence stretched for long moments, broken only by the distant sounds of Morrison's men setting up camp below. Then, from behind a boulder she'd thought was empty, a figure emerged. A young Apache woman, perhaps Sarah's own age, wearing traditional dress that blended perfectly with the rocky landscape. Her dark eyes assessed Sarah with the calm intensity of someone accustomed to making quick decisions about potential threats. "You climb well for a white woman," the Apache woman said in accented but clear English. "But you climb loudly." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here. I'm just trying to run from the men with dogs." The woman interrupted. "We have been watching. You are the healer they seek, the one who learned from Maria Sandoval." The fact that this stranger knew about Maria sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the desert night. "How do you know about Maria?" "Maria was my grandmother's friend. She was taught by our women, and she taught with respect." The Apache woman moved closer, her feet making no sound on the stone. "I am called Ayana. My grandmother sent me to find you." "Your grandmother sent you?" Sarah struggled to understand. How did she know I would be here? Ayana's lips curved in what might have been a smile. My grandmother knows many things. She says the healing knowledge should not be lost because frightened men fear what they do not understand. She paused, listening to the sounds from below. She also says you will die in this desert if you continue alone. The truth of that statement settled over Sarah like a cold blanket. She had perhaps 2 days of water if she was careful, no food except what she could forage, and no real knowledge of the terrain ahead. Morrison's men would catch her eventually, or the desert would claim her. "What does your grandmother want from me?" Sarah asked. "To learn," Ayana replied simply. "To teach. To heal those who need healing." She gestured toward the darkness below, where Morrison's campfire flickered like a distant star. "Those men heal only their own anger. We heal life." As if to emphasize her words, the sound of the dogs grew closer, their baying taking on the excited pitch that meant they'd found a fresh trail. Sarah looked down at the men who would drag her back to face judgment for the crime of keeping her brother alive a little longer, then looked at the Apache woman who offered her an alternative she'd never imagined. "If I come with you," Sarah said carefully, "what happens to me?" "You learn to belong to something larger than their fear," Ayana replied. "You learn to be useful in ways they cannot understand." Sarah Mitchell looked once more at the lights below, then stepped away from the edge, following Ayana deeper into the high country, where ancient knowledge waited to transform a banished healer into something her own people could never have imagined. The Apache camp materialized from the pre-dawn darkness like something conjured from the desert itself. Sarah had been walking for 3 hours behind Ayana, following paths that seemed invisible until her guide pointed them out. Natural corridors between rock formations, game trails that wound around hidden springs, routes that left no trace for Morrison's dogs to follow. Now, as the eastern sky began to lighten, she found herself looking at a settlement that challenged everything she thought she knew about how people lived in this harsh country. The dwellings were temporary, but sophisticated. Brush shelters called wickiups that could be assembled quickly and left no permanent mark on the landscape. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash flourished in carefully tended plots near a hidden spring, while horses grazed in a natural corral formed by fallen boulders. The camp buzzed with quiet activity as people prepared for the day, their movements efficient and purposeful. "My grandmother waits," Ayana said, gesturing toward a wickiup set slightly apart from the others. Smoke rose from its entrance, carrying the scent of burning cedar and something else. Herbs that Sarah couldn't identify but that made her think of healing. The woman who emerged from the dwelling moved with the careful dignity of great age, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed nothing. She was perhaps 70, her gray hair braided with turquoise beads, her weathered hands steady as she gestured for Sarah to sit on a woven mat beside the fire. "I am called Banished," the old woman said in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent. "It means she who heals. Your Maria called me grandmother, though we shared no blood. Now you will learn why." Sarah settled onto the mat, acutely aware of how out of place she must look in her torn dress and dust-covered boots. "Ayana said you sent her to find me. I don't understand how you knew. That frightened men would drive you from your home for healing, instead of letting sickness take its course." Banished interrupted gently. "We have seen this before. White settlers come to this land carrying fear of anything they do not understand. They build walls with their fear, walls around their minds, walls around their hearts, walls around their towns." The old woman reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a handful of dried plants, adding them to the fire. The smoke that rose carried a sweet, complex fragrance that seemed to clear Sarah's mind even as it relaxed her body. "Maria came to us 40 years ago," Banished continued. "Her grandmother was Chiricahua, but she had been raised by Mexican settlers who taught her to be ashamed of her blood. She came seeking to learn what her grandmother's people knew about healing, hoping to bridge the distance her upbringing had created." Sarah thought of Maria's patient teaching, the way the older woman had insisted that healing plants be gathered with respect, that each remedy be prepared with intention and gratitude. She never told me she had learned from your people. Because she knew the fear it would create, Nalnish said simply. But she also knew that knowledge without sharing becomes useless. So she taught you, and through you, the wisdom continues. Over the next several hours, as the camp came fully alive around them, Sarah began to understand the complexity of the community that had taken her in. These were not the savage raiders of frontier legend, but people whose lives revolved around an intimate understanding of the desert and its rhythms. She watched women gather seeds from plants she'd walked past without noticing, saw children learn to identify edible cactus fruits and medicinal roots through patient instruction rather than formal lessons. When the sun reached its zenith, Nalnish rose and gestured for Sarah to follow. "You have knowledge," the old woman said. "But knowledge without understanding is like water without a container. It flows away and leaves nothing behind. Come, we will teach you to listen." They walked to a natural amphitheater formed by red stone walls, where a dozen other women had gathered around small fires. Each fire burned different materials, some wood, some dried grasses, others combinations of plants that filled the air with various fragrances. Sarah recognized some of the women from the camp, but others wore clothing that suggested they'd come from distant places for this gathering. "Every season, we come together to share what we have learned," Nalnish explained. "Healing knowledge belongs to no single person, no single tribe. It belongs to all who would serve life rather than fear it." Sarah spent the afternoon in a state of wonder, watching demonstrations of techniques she'd never imagined. A woman from a northern band showed how to prepare a salve from pine pitch and bear fat that could prevent infection in deep wounds. Another demonstrated the proper way to harvest and prepare willow bark to create a pain remedy, more effective than anything Sarah had learned from European traditions. But it was the philosophy behind the techniques that truly challenged her understanding. These women didn't see themselves as fighting against illness, but as helping the body remember its natural state of health. They spoke of plants as teachers rather than tools, of healing as a conversation between the healer, the patient, and the natural world. "Your people see sickness as punishment," said a woman named Desba, who had been watching Sarah struggle to understand a technique for diagnosing internal ailments through careful observation of the patient's eyes and tongue. "They fight against it as if it were an enemy. But sickness is often the body's way of speaking, of saying what it needs to return to balance." "Then what was my brother's consumption saying?" Sarah asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Desba studied her with compassionate eyes. "Perhaps it was saying that his spirit was ready to travel on, but his body needed time to prepare for the journey. Your medicines gave him that time to complete his earthly relationships, time to face death with dignity rather than agony. This is not failure, sister. This is the highest purpose of healing." As the sun began to set, painting the stone walls in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah found herself surrounded by women who had spent their lives in service to something larger than themselves. They had faced persecution, forced relocations, the constant threat of violence from settlers who feared what they didn't understand. Yet they continued to gather, to share knowledge, to heal anyone who came to them with genuine need. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked Nalnish as the gathering began to disperse. "I'm one of the people who have taken your land, who have driven your families from their homes." The old woman smiled, and in that smile Sarah saw a wisdom that transcended the boundaries human beings drew around themselves. "You are a healer," Nalnish said simply. "Healers belong to all people, just as sickness and pain belong to all people. The desert does not ask who needs water. It provides for all who know how to find it." That night, sleeping in a borrowed blanket beneath stars that seemed close enough to touch, Sarah Mitchell began to understand that she had found more than sanctuary among these people. She had found a way of being in the world that honored both knowledge and humility, that saw healing as a bridge rather than a wall between different ways of understanding life and death. 3 weeks into her stay with Nalnish's band, Sarah was learning to read the desert like a familiar book. She could identify the plants that stored water in their roots, could predict weather changes from the behavior of birds, and was beginning to understand the complex relationships between elevation, soil type, and the medicinal properties of various herbs. But it was her growing fluency in Apache healing techniques that truly marked her transformation from refugee to student. The test came on a scorching afternoon when outriders brought news that would change everything. A cavalry patrol from Fort Tay. Bowie had been ambushed by raiders, not Apache, but a mixed group of Comanchero traders and displaced Comanche warriors who had been terrorizing settlements along the border. The patrol had fought bravely, but suffered heavy casualties, and now they were holed up in a box canyon 20 miles north, with several men badly wounded and no medical supplies. "They are enemies," said Cochidio, a young warrior whose father had been killed in a cavalry attack 2 years earlier. "Let them die as they would let us die." "They are dying men," Nalnish replied quietly. "Dying men have no color, no uniform, no politics. They have only pain and the need for healing." The debate that followed revealed the deep divisions within the Apache community about how to respond to the outside world. Some, like Cochilo, argued that helping their enemies was foolishness that would only invite more violence. Others, particularly the women who had spent their lives healing, insisted that their knowledge came with obligations that transcended tribal loyalties. "I'll go," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I have the skills they need, and I'm not Apache. If this is a trap, if they're suspicious of help from your people, I can approach them as a white woman who happened to be in the area." Ayana shook her head firmly. "Too dangerous. These soldiers, they see Apache and shoot first. But they also see a white woman alone in Apache territory and think she is captive, think she is being used against them. Then, we go together," Sarah said. "You and me, we approach them openly, offering help. If they refuse, we leave. If they accept, we do what we can." Nalnish studied Sarah with those penetrating dark eyes. "You understand what you are offering? These men, if they live, they will return to hunting our people. The wounds you heal may make them stronger enemies. Maria taught me that healing doesn't ask about tomorrow," Sarah replied. "It only asks about now, about the pain that exists in this moment." The old woman nodded slowly. "Then you have learned the most important lesson. But you will not go with only Ayana. If you are to represent our way of healing to these soldiers, you will go with the full authority of our traditions." That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of fire, Sarah found herself participating in a ceremony she could never have imagined. The women of the band gathered around her, each offering something: medicinal plants, tools, knowledge, or simply their blessing. Nalnish presented her with a medicine bundle, a leather pouch containing herbs and stones that represented her new status as a bridge between worlds. "You are no longer Sarah Mitchell, the white woman who fled from her people's fear," Nalnish said as she placed the bundle in Sarah's hands. "You are Sister of the Wind, one who carries healing across the spaces that divide. This is your Apache name, your Apache identity. Carry it with honor." The journey to the canyon took most of the night, Sarah and Ayana traveling with 2 warriors who would remain hidden unless violence threatened. As they rode through the darkness, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a refugee fleeing persecution. Now she was about to walk into a potentially deadly situation as a representative of Apache. Healing traditions. Dawn was breaking as they approached the box canyon where the cavalry patrol was trapped. The scene that greeted them was chaos. Wounded men scattered among the rocks, their horses dead or dying from thirst. The acrid smell of gangrene already beginning to taint the desert air. Sarah counted 8 soldiers, 3 of them unconscious, 2 delirious with fever, and the rest barely coherent from blood loss and dehydration. The sergeant in charge, a grizzled man with a bullet wound in his shoulder, raised his pistol when he saw them approaching. "Stay back. If you're with those Apache devils who—" "I'm not with anyone," Sarah called out, her hands visible and empty. "I'm a healer. I have supplies, medicine, water. These men need help." "You're white," the sergeant said, confusion evident in his voice. "What are you doing out here?" "Saving lives if you'll let me," Sarah replied. She gestured to Ayanna, who was unpacking medical supplies with efficient calm. "This woman is also a healer. We work together." For a moment, Sarah thought the sergeant would refuse. She could see the prejudice and fear warring with desperation in his eyes. But then one of the unconscious men moaned, a sound of such agony that it cut through all other considerations. "Help them," the sergeant said, lowering his weapon. "God help me, I don't care where you learned your skills. Just help them." What followed was 6 hours of the most challenging medical work Sarah had ever attempted. Working side by side with Ayanna, she cleaned and dressed wounds, set broken bones, treated infections with poultices made from plants the soldiers had probably walked past a dozen times. The Apache healing techniques proved remarkably effective. Willow bark tea brought down fevers, desert sage smoke cleared lung infections, and carefully prepared clay drew poison from infected wounds. But it was the collaboration itself that proved most powerful. The soldiers, initially suspicious of Ayanna's presence, gradually came to understand that healing knowledge had no ethnic boundaries. When a young corporal with a shattered leg bone began to recover thanks to an Apache pain remedy, when another man's infected wound began to heal under an indigenous poultice, the artificial divisions between civilized and savage medicine began to crumble. "Where did you learn all this?" the sergeant asked as Sarah finished bandaging his shoulder wound. His fever had broken, and he was thinking clearly for the first time in days. "From teachers who understood that healing belongs to everyone," Sarah replied. "Apache women, Mexican curanderas, frontier mothers who learned by necessity. Knowledge doesn't have a nationality, Sergeant. It only has results." As the sun began to set on what had been a day of transformation, Sarah realized that she had passed some invisible test. Not just the test of treating difficult cases under challenging conditions, but the deeper test of remaining true to Apache healing principles, even when working with people who might later use their recovered strength against her adopted people. "Sister of the Wind," Ayanna said quietly as they prepared for the journey home. "Grandmother chose your name well. You carry healing across boundaries that others see as walls." Sarah looked back at the soldiers they were leaving, men who would live because an Apache woman and a banished healer had refused to let politics determine who deserved care. Tomorrow, some of these men might return to hunting Apache bands. But today, in this canyon, the act of healing had created a moment of understanding that transcended the fear and hatred dividing their peoples. "Sometimes," Sarah said, "healing is about more than bodies. Sometimes it's about healing the spaces between us." 6 months had passed since Sarah's transformation into Sister of the Wind, and the desert had become her teacher in ways she was still discovering. She could track the seasonal movements of medicinal plants, could predict weather patterns from subtle changes in animal behavior, and had developed an intuitive understanding of desert ecology that amazed even her Apache mentors. But it was her growing reputation as a healer who bridged worlds that would soon draw her into a challenge greater than any she had yet faced. The crisis began with dust clouds on the eastern horizon, not the random patterns of wind-blown sand, but the organized movement of a large group traveling with purpose. Ayanna, now Sarah's constant companion and closest friend, shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun and counted the moving shapes with the precision of someone whose life had always depended on such observations. 40 riders, she said quietly. Not cavalry, too irregular, not traders moving too fast. She paused, reading something in the dust patterns that Sarah was still learning to interpret. Refugees. Apache refugees, and they're being followed. The band that arrived at sunset told a story that had become tragically familiar across the Southwest. A group of Mescalero Apache families had been living peacefully on reservation land near Ruidoso when a dispute over water rights erupted into violence. White settlers, claiming that Apache irrigation was interfering with their cattle operations, had convinced the territorial authorities to relocate the Apache families to a more distant reservation. When the families refused to abandon the graves of their ancestors and the farms they had spent years developing, The situation escalated rapidly. "They gave us 3 days to pack everything and leave," explained an elderly man named Nietzsche, whose weathered face bore the marks of recent grief. 3 days to abandon a life we had built over 10 years. When we asked for more time, they brought soldiers. Sarah listened to the familiar story with a growing sense of anger and helplessness. In the 6 months since her arrival, she had seen how Apache communities struggled to maintain their traditions and way of life in the face of constant pressure from expanding white settlements. Every negotiated treaty seemed to last only until someone discovered mineral deposits or decided they needed more grazing land. "There was fighting," Nietzsche continued. "Young men who could not bear to see their families driven from their homes, like cattle. The soldiers killed 3 of our warriors and wounded more. We gathered what we could carry and fled, but they follow us still." Among the refugees were 24 women and children, several elderly people, and 8 wounded men, whose injuries ranged from bullet wounds to broken bones suffered during the chaotic flight from their homes. Sarah and Ayanna immediately began organizing medical care, but it quickly became clear that conventional treatment would not be enough. One of the wounded men, a warrior named Goyathle, had taken a rifle bullet in the chest that had lodged near his lung. The wound was infected, his fever climbing dangerously, and he was beginning to show signs of pneumonia. Sarah had treated similar injuries before, but always with access to proper surgical tools and controlled conditions. Here, with limited supplies and the constant threat of pursuit, she would need to attempt something far more challenging. "He needs surgery," Sarah told Nalnish as they consulted over the dying man. "The bullet must be removed and the wound thoroughly cleaned, or he will die within days." The old healer nodded gravely. "Such operations are possible but dangerous. You would need steady hands, perfect light, and tools we do not have." "Then we make what we need," Sarah said with a determination that surprised her. "And we do it. Tonight before his condition deteriorates further." What followed was a remarkable example of improvised medical cooperation. Using techniques learned from both Apache and European traditions, Sarah and her assistants created a makeshift surgical suite in Nalnish's wiki-up. Ayanna gathered plants whose smoke would help prevent infection, while other women prepared tools by heating metal implements in the fire until they were sterile. Nietzsche, despite his own grief and exhaustion, assisted by providing light from carefully positioned mirrors that reflected the fire's illumination. The surgery itself tested every skill Sarah had acquired over the past months. Working by flickering firelight with tools adapted from everyday implements, she carefully opened the infected wound and traced the path of the bullet. The Apache healing traditions proved invaluable. Poultices that prevented bleeding, herbal preparations that kept the patient unconscious but stable, techniques for managing pain that European medicine had never developed. "Steady," Ayanna whispered as Sarah's hands trembled slightly while extracting the bullet. "Remember what grandmother taught us. The healer must be like water, flowing around obstacles, never forcing what cannot be given freely." The operation took 3 hours, but when it was finished, Goyathle was breathing clearly for the first time in days. The bullet had been removed, the wound thoroughly cleansed, and his fever was already beginning to subside. As Sarah cleaned her improvised instruments, she realized that she had just performed surgery, using techniques that combined the best of 2 medical traditions: European surgical methods enhanced by Apache understanding of infection control and pain management. But the greater test was yet to come. The next morning brought the sound Sarah had been dreading, the organized thunder of cavalry horses approaching at speed. The refugees' pursuers had found them, and this time there would be no avoiding confrontation. Captain William Hayes of the 10th Cavalry was a man caught between duty and conscience, his weathered face showing the strain of years spent enforcing policies he privately questioned. When he rode into the Apache camp with 24 troopers, Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes as he took in the scene. Wounded refugees, women caring for sick children, elderly people who posed no threat to anyone. "I have orders to escort these people to the Mescalero reservation," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man reciting words he wished he didn't have to speak. Any who resist will be considered hostile. Sarah stepped forward, acutely aware that this moment would define not just her own future, but potentially the fate of everyone in the camp. Captain, I'm a medical practitioner. These people have wounded who cannot be moved safely. I'm requesting a medical exemption until they're stable enough to travel. Hayes studied her with obvious confusion. You're white. What are you doing here? Providing medical care to people who need it, Sarah replied. The same thing I would do if your soldiers were wounded. And have you provided care to soldiers? Sarah felt a moment of perfect clarity, understanding that her answer would either create a bridge of understanding or confirm Hayes's worst suspicions about her loyalties. Yes, Captain. 3 weeks ago, I treated casualties from a patrol that was ambushed near Cedar Canyon. Sergeant Murphy and 7 of his men. They were badly wounded, and I helped save their lives. Hayes's expression changed immediately. Murphy's patrol? You're the healer who worked with that Apache woman to patch up my men? I am. For a long moment, the captain stared at Sarah, clearly wrestling with implications that challenged his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Finally, he dismounted and approached the wiki-up where Goyathle was recovering. Show me, he said simply. What Hayes saw in that wiki-up was a wounded Apache warrior receiving medical care that combined surgical precision with indigenous healing methods. He saw a white woman who had clearly been accepted as an equal by Apache. Healers working alongside Native women to save lives without regard for tribal affiliation or political boundaries. Captain, Sarah said as Hayes finished his examination, these people aren't raiders or hostiles. They're families who were driven from their homes by a water dispute. The wounded men fought only to protect their families during the evacuation. If you force them to move now in their current condition, several will die unnecessarily. Hayes was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert that had become home to so much conflict and misunderstanding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would define his career and possibly his conscience. I'm going to recommend to my commanding officer that this group be granted temporary medical sanctuary, he said. The wounded will be allowed to recover before any relocation occurs. In the meantime, I'll station a small guard detachment nearby, for their protection as much as for security. As the captain prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with something approaching respect in his eyes. What you're doing here, bridging the gap between our peoples through healing, it gives me hope that maybe we can find better ways to resolve our differences. That evening, as Sarah sat with Nalnish watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson, the old healer smiled with deep satisfaction. Sister of the Wind, Nalnish said softly, you have learned the greatest lesson of all. Healing is not just about bodies. It is about healing the hatred that separates people who should be learning from each other. Sarah nodded, understanding finally that her banishment from Millbrook had not been an ending, but a beginning. She had found her true calling not as someone who chose sides in conflicts, but as someone who refused to let conflict prevent healing. In the vast desert that had nearly claimed her life, she had discovered a purpose larger than the fear and prejudice that had driven her from her original home. The Apache had called her Sister of the Wind, and she had learned to carry healing across the artificial boundaries that divided peoples who shared the same sky, the same earth, and ultimately, the same need for compassion in a harsh and beautiful world.